Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for December 10th, 2024. Well, we're in the midst of a very fast-moving situation, and let me begin by saying there are many versions circulating as to what actually happened in Syria. Some of it's gossip, some of it's informed to some extent. The issue is, why did the Assad government fall so quickly? And there are many, many explanations, but I want to stick with what I think are the two that are most clear and most accurate. One I talked about yesterday, the Chaz Freeman assessment, that essentially there had to have been some kind of deal in the background between Turkey and Russia. But as Chaz said, it's too early to reach any firm conclusions. Let the dust settle. All things are a little bit murky. Now, today I want to present the insights from Jacques Beau, a well-known retired Swiss intelligence officer. And what Beau said is that the issue here is not anything that's internal. It's not a Syrian issue, not a local fight. And what he emphasized is the international side of this battle. So let me give you some of what he said. What happened in Syria was not an inside rebellion. It was entirely steered from the outside. Already in 2011, when the so-called Arab Spring and the so-called civil war in Syria erupted, this was 85% fighters coming from Benghazi, that is Libya, and the so-called Libyan revolution. Then in 2014, there was a massive flood of fighters from Libya, Turkey, Iraq, Russia, Dagestan, Chechnya, and the revolt was entirely staged from the outside. Now, what he then, given that that's the case, that you had this big revolt, what was it that weakened the Syrian government? You had the Caesar sanctions imposed by the United States, which created an economic catastrophe inside the country, which had to affect the military because it affected everyone. Intermittent electricity outages, lack of food, very insecure living, even after the main forces of the jihadists had been defeated. Secondly, you had the U.S. seized the oil fields, and that deprived the government of revenue and also the fuel. So there was enormous pressure on the Assad government. So Beau went on to continue that as this pressure developed, and especially after Israel attacked and severely decimated the ranks of Hezbollah, especially the leadership, there was a demoralization in the Syrian army. Now, at that point, it became clear you had, as Chaz Freeman said, not a ragtag band of rebel militias, but an actual well-equipped, well-trained army, trained by Turkey, well-equipped probably by Turkey and NATO, including Ukraine. And there may have as well been a Putin-Erdogan deal not to push the fight. So here's what Jacques Beau then said. The Syrian government decided they could not take up this fight, especially because these rebels in the meantime were extremely well armed, trained by the Ukrainian special forces with US weapons. So when Assad had to make the choice between either fighting a bloody war again with no means or abandoning power, he chose to surrender and preserve the lives of the population of Syria. Now, of course, the media has a very different take on that it was a popular uprising against a brutal dictator, and that the people had had enough. They were no longer willing to tolerate the Assad family in power and so on. And again, just as in the case of the Maidan revolution, or actually regime change coup in Ukraine, there's the same story. And that narrative is that people were tired of being oppressed, And we're looking for freedom and democracy. And some people are driven by that. But there's also a sense of desperation that's created. And then the appearance of an outside force that is going to bring peace. And that, I think, is what we see from the review of Chaz and Jacques Beau. Now, this is occurring in a very interesting moment, with Netanyahu going on trial today for corruption. And Netanyahu, of course, is cheerleading the events. He's excited. Israel won. He's claiming victory. The question is, what happens next? Not just in Syria, but in the world in which Syria is a part. Now, immediately we may see a new flood of refugees. And this is something that Europe is not prepared for. But the point is that regime change doesn't solve the problem that existed before the regime change. And that is an economic crisis of global proportions. And the problem we're facing now is precisely that economic crisis. The fact that the global financial system is in a breakdown crisis, that we're not producing enough, and at the same time we're continuing to exist on the basis of printing money and increasing debt. And that's not a good strategy. So you have the breakdown of the free trade system, the breakdown of the so-called globalist system. And is the answer a retreat into isolationism and protective tariffs? Well, tariffs can play a role, but that's not the point. The bigger question is what happens now when the nations in the formerly colonial system, that is the former colonies, no longer agree to sacrifice their future to pay the debt and at the same time give away cheap raw materials and cheap labor. They're insisting on their sovereignty, their sovereign rights. And the IMF system has always been based on you rob Peter to pay Paul. You go steal from the poorer countries to maintain some semblance of a better standard of living in the richer countries. But that system isn't going to work anymore. The Global South is saying, no, we're not going to accept that. They're demanding sovereignty. And they now have institutions with the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which will defend their sovereignty, defend it economically and militarily, because Russia and China are peer military powers with the United States and NATO. So what's the other factor? Well, the rebellion in the so-called developed countries. We see it in the elections, one after another. Governments fall. People are unhappy. There are no economic solutions. We saw it with Biden and Harris. They had nothing new to offer. They claimed inflation is solved, and it's not. They claim, don't worry about $35 trillion in national debt, it's no problem. Well, it is. So how do you deal with this kind of crisis? That's what we discussed in panel 3 of last weekend's Schiller Institute conference. The role of great projects based on science drivers in producing new value to the economy of productive goods, productive wealth, and not just goods, but the ability to constantly increase the productivity of labor. That's where wealth comes from. When you have new technologies based on scientific discovery, which increase the productivity of every laborer, that's where the value added comes in. And it's physical value, not funny money, not paper money that's backed by nothing but promissory notes. So as we address this crisis, this is what we have to look at. How do you increase the overall production of physical wealth so that every nation, every sovereign nation, has the ability to develop a full set economy? And that's what was taken up in panel 3. What are the projects that can do it? What are the technologies that have to be brought online? Now, this is also a strategy that addresses the crisis, the interrelationship between the poorer countries and the wealthier countries. On Thursday, I'm going to discuss a little bit about what the Chinese are doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. I know many people are skeptical about it, but the fact is that the Chinese are not only eliminating poverty, but they're alleviating the tensions that produce terrorism, including in Xinjiang province, despite all the lies you're hearing. So join me on Thursday. I'll be discussing that. Tomorrow, Diane Sayre will be here for the update. And I'm putting in the description section the links to two things. One, panel 3 from last weekend's conference. And secondly, the new pamphlet that's being produced by the Schiller Institute on how to increase jobs, billions of jobs, decrease the number of refugees, and end the wars. It's a pamphlet you need to have. You need to circulate it. Get it to your friends. And once you realize that, make a contribution to the Schiller Institute so our voice can be expanded. So thanks for listening. I'll see you again Thursday. Don't forget, it'll be Diane Sayre